I've created a 5-part story outline based on your title. The narrative follows Sarah Miller, a young orphan living on the American frontier in 1832, who encounters and helps Wachiwi, a Shawnee girl with an injured ankle. The story develops through their meeting, Sarah's difficult choice to help Wachiwi cross the river, her night in the Shawnee camp, the tense return crossing, and culminates in a dawn meeting that offers the possibility of peace between the two communities. Would you like me to modify any aspects of this outline? I can adjust the tone, historical elements, or character development if needed. I understand you'd like me to expand part 1 of the story into a 1,400-word version with simple language and a natural tone. I'll create this as a separate document, avoiding common names like Sarah, making it human-centric, and ensuring it's appropriate for YouTube standards. The little wooden cabin sat at the edge of Pinewood Creek, its weathered logs and crooked chimney telling stories of harsh winters and scorching summers. This was home to 12-year-old Annie and her grandmother, Rose. They lived alone. The last of their family line after fever had swept through the settlement 3 winters ago, taking Annie's parents and baby brother to their graves on the hillside. The year was 1832, and life on the frontier demanded strength from even its smallest inhabitants. Annie had grown used to the weight of responsibility that rested on her narrow shoulders. Each morning, she rose before the sun, rekindling the fire and preparing a simple porridge before helping Grandmother Rose from her bed. The old woman's joints had grown stiff with age, though her mind remained sharp as the hunting knife that hung by their door. Morning brings its own gifts, Rose would say, watching the sunrise through their single window. It was one of many sayings she repeated, little seeds of wisdom planted in Annie's heart. Their cabin stood apart from the main settlement, partly because Rose preferred the quiet, and partly because some folks still whispered about her strange ways. Rose knew which plants could heal a fever, and which could ease a difficult birth. Some called this knowledge a blessing. Others crossed themselves when she passed by. Annie paid little mind to the whispers. She knew the truth of her grandmother's gentle hands and kind heart. The small plot behind their cabin burst with vegetables and herbs in careful rows, beans climbing their poles toward the sky, squash spreading their broad leaves along the ground, and the special medicinal plants Rose tended with extra care. This garden fed them through summer and, preserved properly, kept hunger at bay through winter's lean months. The earth provides if we listen to what it needs, Rose often told Annie while they worked side by side, dirt under their fingernails and the sun warming their backs. Beyond their garden stretched the deep woods, and beyond those woods flowed the wide river that everyone knew marked the boundary between the settlers' world and that of the Shawnee people. Annie had never crossed that river, though sometimes she would sit on a high rock overlooking the water and wonder about the lives lived on the other side. The adults of Pinewood Creek spoke of the Shawnee in low, worried tones. More settlers arrived each month, cutting down trees and building cabins closer and closer to the river's edge. The uneasy peace between the two peoples stretched thinner with each passing season. Most children in the settlement played games about savage Indians attacking, taking turns being brave defenders or whooping attackers. Annie never joined these games. Something about them felt wrong, disrespectful somehow. People fear what they don't understand, Rose would say when Annie asked why everyone seemed so frightened of their neighbors across the river. And fear makes folks do foolish things. Annie's days followed the rhythm of frontier life, gathering eggs from their 4 chickens, tending the garden, mending clothes, and helping Rose prepare remedies for those brave enough to visit the witch woman and her quiet granddaughter. Once a week they walked to the settlement's small trading post, bringing eggs or herbs to trade for things they couldn't make themselves. Salt, sugar, the occasional length of fabric. These trips always left Annie with mixed feelings. She longed for friendship with the other children, but they treated her with the same wary distance they showed her grandmother. Only the blacksmith's son Thomas ever showed her kindness, sometimes slipping her a piece of hard candy when no one was looking. "Your grandma saved my ma when I was being born," he once whispered. Pa says we owe her my life. As summer gave way to autumn, the woods transformed into a painting of gold, crimson, and burnt orange. This was Annie's favorite time, the air crisp and sweet with the scent of fallen leaves, the forest floor carpeted with colors. It was also the time for gathering the last gifts of the wild before winter wrapped the world in white. Rose had taught Annie which berries remained safe to eat late in the season, which nuts were worth collecting, and which mushrooms might mean the difference between hunger and comfort in February's coldest days. Always leave some behind, Rose instructed. We share the forest with creatures who cannot store food in cellars. One golden afternoon in late October, Rose's joints pained her too much for the long walk to the berry patches near the river. The first frost would come soon, and they needed those final berries for Rose's cough syrup that helped so many through winter illness. I can go alone, Annie offered, seeing her grandmother wince as she tried to stand from her rocking chair. I know which ones to pick and where to find them. Rose studied her granddaughter's face, seeing not just the child before her, but the young woman emerging, responsible beyond her years yet still innocent to many of the world's harsher truths. Take the small knife. Rose finally nodded. Be back before the sun touches the treetops. And Annie, her voice dropped lower, stay on our side of the river. Annie nodded solemnly, tucking the little blade into the pocket of her apron and grabbing her gathering basket. The path leading from their cabin into the woods was well worn, a testament to the countless trips they'd made together. The fallen leaves crunched pleasantly beneath her worn leather shoes as she walked, occasionally stopping to add an acorn or interesting feather to her collection of treasures. The forest welcomed her like an old friend, branches swaying gently in the autumn breeze as if waving hello. Squirrels chattered indignantly as she passed their gathering spots, and somewhere in the distance a woodpecker drummed against a hollow tree. Annie knew these woods as well as she knew the lines on her own palms. Which trail led to the best blackberries? Which clearing filled with spring flowers? Which ancient oak had the perfect climbing branches? As she walked, Annie hummed a tune her mother had once sung, one of the few memories that hadn't faded with time. The melody drifted through the trees, keeping her company as she made her way toward the river where the late-season berries grew in abundance. The berry patch sat in a small clearing not far from the riverbank, where sunshine reached the forest floor unhindered by the canopy above. Annie knelt among the bushes, carefully selecting the plumpest berries and avoiding those that had already begun to shrivel. Her fingers moved quickly, stained purple-red as her basket slowly filled. She worked methodically, moving from bush to bush, occasionally popping a particularly tempting berry into her mouth, its sweetness bursting against her tongue. Time slipped away as it often did when Annie was absorbed in a task. The sun had begun its westward descent when she finally straightened, arching her back to ease the stiffness. Her basket was nearly full, enough for Rose's medicine and perhaps a small pie if they were careful with the precious sugar. Annie decided to rest a moment before heading home. The river called to her, its gentle rushing sound pulling her toward the boundary everyone in the settlement respected and feared. She knew she shouldn't go too close, but surely looking wouldn't break her grandmother's rule. Setting her basket carefully at the base of a tree, Annie walked the short distance to the riverbank. The water flowed wide and strong before her, autumn rains having swelled its banks. Across its width, the forest continued. The same trees, the same colors, the same world reflected like a mirror. Annie sat on a large, flat rock overlooking the current, dangling her feet above the water without quite touching it. From this vantage point, she could see far downstream where the river bent around a stand of tall pines. This was her secret place, though she'd never admitted to Rose that she sometimes came here alone. Something about the boundary water fascinated her. How it divided yet connected, how it moved constantly yet always remained. Annie often wondered what it would be like to cross over, to walk among the trees on the other side that looked so similar, yet felt so forbidden. As the sun continued its descent, Annie knew she should head back. Rose would worry if she wasn't home by dusk. She stood brushing dirt from her simple dress when a sound caught her attention, so faint she almost missed it beneath the river's constant murmur. A whimper, then another, human sounds of pain or fear. Annie froze, her heart suddenly beating faster. The settlement's warnings about the dangerous savages across the river flashed through her mind. But the sounds didn't come from across the water. They came from downstream along her own side of the bank. Common sense told her to grab her basket and run home. But something stronger pulled her toward the sound. The same instinct that led Rose to help anyone who came to their door, regardless of whispers or fearful looks, leaving her berries behind. Annie crept toward the source of the sounds. moving quietly as Rose had taught her when they hunted mushrooms and didn't want to frighten the deer. The riverbank grew steeper here, forcing her to grab at exposed roots for balance as she made her way down toward the water's edge. And there, huddled against a fallen log where the river had carved away part of the bank, was a girl. I've written the first part of the story as requested, expanding it to approximately 1,400 words. The narrative introduces Annie instead of Sarah, and her grandmother Rose instead of Martha, establishing their life on the frontier in 1832 and the tensions between settlers and the Shawnee tribe. I've used simple, natural language while creating an engaging narrative that builds toward Annie discovering a mysterious girl by the river. The writing maintains a human-centric approach with authentic details about frontier life, herbal knowledge, and the social dynamics of the settlement. I've avoided any content that would violate YouTube policies, focusing instead on creating a rich, historical setting and establishing Annie's character as compassionate and curious despite the prejudices around her. Would you like me to make any adjustments to this first part before I continue with the other sections? I'll write part 2 of the story following your guidelines, using simple language, maintaining an engaging human-centric narrative, and avoiding any content that could violate YouTube policies. I'll continue with the characters established in part 1, but avoid the names you mentioned. Helped a limping native girl cross the river. Part 2. Annie's breath caught in her throat. The girl huddled against the fallen log was unlike any child from the settlement. Her skin was the color of burnished copper. Her long black hair hung in 2 braids adorned with small beads, and her clothing, a simple dress made of soft deerskin, was decorated with intricate patterns of tiny beads and quills. A Shawnee girl here on the settlers' side of the river. For a moment, Annie stood frozen, unsure what to do. The stories whispered around settlement fires came rushing back, tales of raids and scalping and stolen children. But the girl before her looked nothing like the fearsome warriors from those stories. She looked small and scared, one hand clutching her ankle, her face twisted in pain. When the Shawnee girl spotted Annie, her dark eyes widened with fear. She tried to scramble away but cried out as she put weight on her injured ankle. "I won't hurt you," Annie said softly, holding her hands up to show they were empty. The girl wouldn't understand her words, but perhaps she would understand the gesture. Annie pointed to herself. "Annie," she said clearly. The girl stared, still tense but no longer trying to flee. After a moment of consideration, she placed her hand against her chest. "Kimmy," she said, her voice barely louder than the river's gentle flow. "Kimmy," Annie repeated, and the girl gave the barest hint of a nod. Slowly, careful not to make any sudden movements, Annie approached and knelt beside Kimmy. The Shawnee girl watched her warily but allowed her to come close. Annie pointed to Kimmy's ankle, then raised her eyebrows in question. Understanding crossed Kimmy's face and she extended her leg slightly, wincing as she moved. The ankle was badly swollen, already turning purple with bruising. Not broken, Annie thought, remembering what Rose had taught her about injuries, but definitely sprained. She looked up at the steep, eroded bank above them, then at the deepening shadows as afternoon began its slide into evening. How had Kimmy ended up here alone and hurt, on the settlers' side of the river? As if reading her thoughts, Kimmy gestured toward the water, then made a wobbling motion with her hand before pointing to her ankle. Annie understood. She must have been crossing at the shallow ford half a mile upstream, slipped on the wet rocks, and been carried downstream by the current before managing to drag herself ashore. "Your people," Annie said, pointing across the river. "They'll be worried." Kimmy's eyes filled with tears she was clearly trying hard not to shed. She nodded, then looked up at the steep bank and back at her injured ankle, the impossibility of her situation clear. She couldn't climb that bank on her own, and even if she couldn't walk all the way back to the ford and cross the river with her injury. Night would fall soon and the autumn nights were getting colder. Annie bit her lower lip, thinking hard. Rose would be expecting her home soon. If she didn't return by dusk, her grandmother might send someone looking for her. What would the men from the settlement do if they found Kimmy? The uneasy peace between settlers and Shawnee had been growing more strained with each passing season. Finding a Shawnee girl on their side of the river might be all it took to spark something terrible. But she couldn't leave Kimmy here alone, injured and frightened, with night coming on. Rose had taught her better than that. "I'll help you," Annie decided. speaking more to herself than to Kimi since the other girl couldn't understand her words. First things first, they needed to get up the steep bank to level ground. Annie mimed climbing, then pointed to Kimi's back, suggesting she could help push her up. Kimi watched Annie's gestures with intelligent eyes and nodded her understanding. It took 3 tries. On the first attempt, Kimi's hand slipped on the muddy bank and she slid back down with a muffled cry of pain. The second time, Annie tried to push from below, but wasn't strong enough to boost Kimi's weight upward. For the third try, Annie found a sturdy branch, wedged it into the bank to create a handhold, then helped guide Kimi's foot to the natural steps formed by exposed tree roots. With this extra support, Kimi managed to drag herself up, collapsing at the top in a heap of exhaustion and pain. Annie scrambled up after her, breathing hard from the effort. Kimi's face was pale beneath her copper skin, and sweat beaded on her forehead despite the cool air. The ankle had taken more strain during their climb and looked worse than before. They needed to rest, but not here, so close to the river where anyone might come upon them. Annie retrieved her berry basket from where she'd left it, then helped Kimi to her feet. With Annie's shoulder supporting her weight, they hobbled slowly away from the river and into the protective cover of the forest. Annie led them to a small clearing she knew well, a place where wild mint grew in abundance around the base of a lightning-struck oak. The ground here was soft with fallen leaves, and the hollow trunk of the old oak offered some shelter. Settling Kimi against the trunk, Annie quickly gathered dry branches and built a small fire as Rose had taught her, striking flint to steel until sparks caught the tinder. As flames licked upward, Annie assessed their situation with growing concern. The sun hung low now, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. She should have been home already. Rose would be worried sick. But Kimi couldn't walk far, certainly not all the way to the ford and across the river in her condition. There was only one solution Annie could see. She would have to help Kimi cross the river, which meant crossing it herself. The thought made her stomach tighten with fear. No one from the settlement crossed that boundary unless absolutely necessary, and children never did. What would the Shawnee on the other side think of a settler girl appearing with one of their injured children? What would Rose say when she found out? What would the settlement do if they discovered her betrayal? But looking at Kimi's face in the flickering firelight, Annie knew she had no choice. This wasn't about settlers and Shawnee boundaries and fears. This was about one person helping another. Annie offered Kimi some berries from her basket, which the girl accepted with a grateful nod. While Kimi ate, Annie searched the surrounding area, finally finding what she was looking for. A sturdy young sapling, straight and strong. Using the small knife from her pocket, she cut it down and trimmed away the branches, creating a walking stick for Kimi. By the time she finished, darkness had settled around them, the forest transforming into a world of shadows and sounds. Owls called from high branches, and somewhere in the distance, a fox barked. The temperature was dropping quickly now that the sun had disappeared. "We'll need to stay here tonight," Annie said, gesturing to the sky and then miming sleep. Kimi seemed to understand and nodded, though her eyes were anxious. She made a rocking motion with her arms, then pointed across the river. Someone waiting for her, Annie guessed. A mother, perhaps, or grandmother like Rose. "Tomorrow," Annie promised, pointing to the eastern horizon where the sun would rise. "We'll go tomorrow." They built up the fire for warmth and safety. Annie showed Kimi how to pile leaves into a soft bed inside the hollow oak, where they would be protected from the wind. Neither girl slept much that night. They lay side by side in the oak's embrace, listening to the night sounds and watching the stars through gaps in the autumn canopy. Despite not sharing a language, they found ways to communicate, pointing at constellations, miming animals, sharing silent laughter when dawn came with a heavy mist rising from the river, painting the forest in dreamlike white. Annie's dress was damp with dew and her stomach growled with hunger. The berries they'd shared the night before had been a poor substitute for dinner. Kimi looked better after a night's rest, though her ankle remained swollen. "We should go before it gets too late," Annie said, helping Kimi to her feet and handing her the walking stick. Their progress was painfully slow. What would have been a 15-minute walk for Annie alone took over an hour with Kimi hobbling beside her, leaning heavily on both the stick and Annie's shoulder. By the time they reached the river, the morning mist had burned away, and the sun shone brightly in a clear autumn sky. Annie had deliberately avoided the ford where people from the settlement sometimes crossed. Instead, she brought them to a spot half a mile downstream, where she knew the river ran wide but shallow, with many exposed rocks creating a natural, if precarious, stepping stone path. In summer, when the water ran lower, children from the settlement would sometimes dare each other to go halfway across these stones, though never all the way to the other side. Now, with autumn rains, the water ran higher, covering some of the stones and making others slippery with moss. Annie's heart sank as she surveyed their crossing. It would be difficult for her alone. With Kimi injured, it seemed almost impossible. Kimi looked equally doubtful, eyeing the rushing water with apprehension. But when she lifted her gaze to the far shore, determination hardened her features. Home was there, just beyond that watery boundary. She gripped her walking stick tighter and nodded to Annie. "Careful," Annie warned, though Kimi couldn't understand the word. "Step exactly where I step." Annie went first, testing each stone before committing her weight to it. The water rushed around the rocks, cold enough to make her gasp when it occasionally splashed over her shoes. The first few steps weren't so bad, but as they moved toward the center, the current grew stronger and the gaps between stones wider. Halfway across, disaster struck. Kimi, balancing awkwardly with her injured ankle, placed her walking stick on a moss-covered stone. The stick slid and Kimi lurched sideways with a cry of alarm. Annie turned just in time to see her falling. Without thinking, she lunged back, grabbing Kimi's arm with both hands. For one terrifying moment, they both teetered on the edge of falling into the rushing current. Annie's feet slipped on the wet stone and cold water swirled around her ankles. Kimi's added weight pulled her forward and Annie felt herself losing balance. But then, summoning strength she didn't know she possessed, Annie pulled back hard, steadying them both. They stood frozen for several heartbeats, clutching each other on a stone barely big enough for both their feet, the walking stick gone, carried away by the current. "It's okay," Annie gasped, though her heart hammered against her ribs. "We're okay." The rest of the crossing was a test of courage and balance. Without the walking stick, Kimi relied entirely on Annie for support. They moved stone by stone, agonizingly slow, the far shore seeming to retreat with each careful step. Annie's arms ached from supporting Kimi's weight, and both girls were soaked from splashing water by the time they finally, miraculously, reached the other side. They collapsed on the bank, breathing hard, letting the morning sun warm their wet clothes and cold skin. Annie looked back at the way they had come, hardly believing they had made it across. She had done it. She had crossed the boundary river. She was now in Shawnee territory, a place no child from her settlement had ever willingly gone. As the realization sank in, a new fear took hold. She had crossed the river. Now she would have to find her way back alone. I've written part 2 of the story continuing Annie and Kimi's journey. This section focuses on their initial meeting, the language barrier they overcome, and Annie's decision to help Kimi despite the risks. The narrative builds toward their perilous river crossing, ending with them reaching the Shawnee side and Annie realizing the implications of her choice. The writing maintains a simple, engaging style with natural dialogue and descriptions. I've incorporated period-appropriate details while keeping the language accessible. The narrative emphasizes human connection across cultural divides while building tension through the physical challenges they face. Would you like me to make any adjustments to this second part? I can modify the tone, pacing, or specific elements if needed. I'll write part 3 of the story following your guidelines, continuing with Annie and Kimi's journey as they reach the Shawnee territory. Helped a limping native girl cross the river, part 3. The far side of the river looked much like Annie's familiar woods, yet somehow different. The trees stood in the same autumn splendor, but the paths winding between them were unfamiliar. Birds called overhead with the same voices, yet Annie felt as though she had stepped into another world entirely. Kimi tugged gently at Annie's sleeve, pointing deeper into the forest. Her dark eyes held both gratitude and urgency. They needed to move to find her people. Annie nodded, helping Kimi to her feet once more. Without the walking stick, their progress was even slower than before. Kimi's arm draped across Annie's shoulders, her weight causing Annie's knees to buckle slightly with each step. The forest floor here showed signs of regular use, small paths worn into the earth, trees marked with symbols Annie didn't understand. Kimi directed them with gestures and soft words in her own language. guiding them along trails invisible to Annie's untrained eye. After they had walked for perhaps half an hour, Kimmy suddenly stiffened. She made a small gesture for Annie to stop, her head tilted as though listening. Annie heard nothing beyond the usual forest sounds, but Kimmy's face had lit up with recognition. She called out, a musical phrase that rose and fell like birdsong. An answering call came from somewhere ahead, and Kimmy sagged with relief against Annie's side. Within moments, two figures emerged from between the trees, young men dressed in buckskin carrying bows across their backs. They froze at the sight of Annie, their expressions changing from concern to shock to suspicion in the span of heartbeats. Kimmy spoke rapidly, gesturing to her ankle and then to Annie. The young men exchanged glances, clearly uncertain about the presence of a settler child so far across the boundary. One of them stepped forward, studying Annie with intense eyes. He couldn't have been more than 16, his face still holding the softness of youth despite his serious expression. He spoke directly to Annie in halting, heavily accented English. "Why you bring her?" Annie swallowed hard, finding her voice. "She was hurt. On our side of the river, I helped her cross back." The young man translated this for his companion, whose eyebrows rose in apparent surprise. More words were exchanged in their language, too quick for Annie to catch any meaning. Finally, the English speaker nodded. "We take to village. Both." Before Annie could respond, the second young man had already lifted Kimmy carefully into his arms. She looked tiny against his broad chest, like a child much younger than her 12 or 13 years. Kimmy reached out, catching Annie's hand and squeezing it briefly. A silent thank you, before the young man carried her away down the path. The English speaker gestured for Annie to follow. "Come," he said simply. Annie hesitated, glancing back toward the river. Rose would be frantic by now. The settlement might already be organizing search parties. She should return immediately, explain to her grandmother what had happened, face whatever punishment came from crossing the boundary. But Kimmy was looking back at her with pleading eyes, and Annie knew she couldn't just turn around and leave, not without making sure the girl was safely home. She nodded and followed the young men deeper into Shawnee territory. The path wound through ancient trees, across small streams, and around rocky outcroppings. Annie tried to memorize the way, but the unfamiliar landscape soon had her completely turned around. They walked for what felt like hours but was probably less than one, the young men setting a pace that had Annie trotting to keep up, despite their burden of carrying Kimmy. When they finally emerged from the densest part of the forest into a clearing, Annie stopped short, her mouth falling open slightly. Before her lay a Shawnee village, so different from the settlers' cabins and yet somehow familiar in its purpose. Dome-shaped dwellings made of bent saplings covered with bark and woven mats stood in a rough circle around a central open area. Smoke rose from holes in their roofs, carrying the scent of cooking fires. Between the structures, life happened. Women worked outside, scraping hides or weaving baskets. Children played a game with sticks and a small leather ball. An old man sat in the sun, carving something from a piece of wood. All activity ceased as they entered the clearing. Dozens of eyes turned to stare at the strange procession. Two young hunters, one carrying an injured girl, followed by a wide-eyed settler child still damp from the river crossing. A cry broke the silence. An older woman rushed forward, arms outstretched toward Kimmy. The family resemblance was unmistakable, the same delicate features, the same intelligent eyes, though the woman's face was lined with years and worry. Kimmy's mother, Annie, guessed, or perhaps her grandmother. The young man gently transferred Kimmy into the woman's embrace, and rapid conversation followed. Too many voices speaking at once for Annie to make any sense of it, even if she had understood the language. Annie stood awkwardly at the edge of the gathering, acutely aware of her outsider status. Children about her age peered at her from behind adults, whispering to each other. Their faces showed the same mixture of curiosity and wariness that settlement children displayed when strangers passed through Pinewood Creek. The crowd parted as a tall man made his way toward them. Unlike the others, who wore simple, practical clothing, his buckskin shirt was elaborately decorated with beadwork and quills. A single eagle feather stood upright in his long black hair. He carried himself with quiet authority that reminded Annie of the settlement's mayor on council days. Everyone fell silent as he approached. He looked first at Kimmy, still held in the older woman's arms, then at Annie. His gaze was neither friendly nor hostile, simply assessing, taking her measure. When he spoke, his deep voice carried easily across the clearing, though Annie understood none of the words. The English-speaking young man stepped forward. He asks why child of white settlers brings his daughter home. Annie's heart skipped a beat. Kimi was the daughter of someone important, perhaps the chief himself. No wonder the entire village had reacted so strongly to her return. I found her hurt by the river, Annie explained, her voice smaller than she intended. On my side. She couldn't walk well. I couldn't leave her there with night coming. As the young man translated, the chief's expression remained unreadable. He asked another question. He asked if you know you break boundary law, if you know penalty for crossing river. Annie swallowed hard. She had known crossing the river was forbidden, but no one had ever specified exactly what happened to those who broke that rule. The settlement's warnings had always been vague, more focused on the dangers posed by savages than on any formal agreement between the two peoples. I knew I shouldn't cross, she answered honestly. But I couldn't think of another way to get her home. More translation, followed by murmurs from the gathered crowd. The chief studied Annie for a long moment, then spoke again, this time directly to the older woman holding Kimi. She nodded and, with Kimi still in her arms, approached Annie. Up close, Annie could see that what she had taken for anger in the woman's expression was actually intense emotion of a different kind. Without warning, the woman reached out with her free hand and touched Annie's hair, then her cheek, with a gentleness that reminded her painfully of Rose. She spoke softly. She thanks you, the young translator explained. Says you have heart of old spirits, not fear of new ways. He looked uncomfortable with these words, as though not entirely sure he'd translated correctly or perhaps not entirely agreeing with the sentiment. The chief spoke again, and this time his words seemed to be directed to the entire village as much as to Annie. The crowd's response was mixed, some nodding, others looking doubtful or concerned. He says you will stay until morning, the young man told Annie. Too dangerous to cross river now. Tomorrow warriors take you back to your side. Relief flooded through Annie, followed immediately by a fresh wave of worry. Overnight, Rose would be beside herself with fear. The entire settlement might be searching the woods by now, but the chief's tone made it clear this was not a suggestion, but a decision already made. The older woman, Kimi's grandmother, Annie learned later, led her to one of the dome-shaped dwellings at the edge of the clearing. Inside it was surprisingly spacious and warm, with mats covering the packed earth floor and furs piled in the corners for bedding. A central fire pit glowed with coals, filling the space with gentle warmth and the scent of cedar. Kimi was already there, her injured ankle wrapped in some kind of poultice that smelled strongly of herbs. She smiled when Annie entered, patting the mat beside her in invitation. For the next few hours, Annie experienced a world entirely different from her own, yet familiar in its humanity. The grandmother heated water and helped both girls wash away the dirt and sweat of their ordeal. She brought them food, a rich stew of meat and wild roots, served in wooden bowls with a flat bread unlike anything Annie had tasted before. Though they shared no language, the old woman's gentle hands and kind eyes spoke volumes as she tended to both children with equal care. As evening fell, more people came to the dwelling, each one studying Annie with varying degrees of curiosity. Young children were less reserved, touching her light brown hair with wondering fingers before being gently shooed away by adults. A group of girls Kimi's age giggled together in the corner, occasionally glancing Annie's way and whispering behind their hands. Kimi fell asleep early, exhausted by pain and the day's events. Annie sat awake longer, watching the family move around the dwelling with the easy familiarity of people who had shared space for generations. Despite the strangeness of her surroundings, she felt no fear. These people, whom the settlement described in such terrifying terms, were just that. People. They laughed and scolded and yawned just like the families in Pinewood Creek. Later, lying on a surprisingly comfortable mat beneath soft furs, Annie stared up at the smoke hole where stars peeked through. Her thoughts turned to Rose, alone in their cabin, probably sick with worry. Would she be angry when Annie returned? Would the settlement punish her for crossing the boundary? Would they understand that she had only done what Rose herself had always taught her, to help those in need regardless of who they might be? Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. For tonight, Annie let the rhythmic breathing of the sleeping family around her lull her toward dreams. Her last waking thought a prayer that Rose would somehow understand why she hadn't come home. Outside, beyond the dwelling's walls, night creatures sang their ancient songs, the same melodies that echoed through the forests on both sides of the river that divided two worlds. Worlds that, despite their differences, existed beneath the same stars. I've written part 3 of the story, focusing on Annie's journey into the Shawnee village after crossing the river with Kimi. This section explores her first encounter with Kimi's people, the cultural differences she observes, and her growing realization that despite their different ways of life, the Shawnee share the same fundamental human experiences as the settlers. The narrative maintains a simple, engaging style with natural descriptions and dialogue. I've incorporated historically appropriate details, while emphasizing the human connections that transcend cultural boundaries. This part builds on the themes established earlier while setting up tension for Annie's eventual return to her own community. Would you like me to make any adjustments to this third part before continuing with part 4? I'll write part 4 of the story following your guidelines. Continuing Annie's journey as she prepares to return to her settlement. Helped a limping native girl cross the river in part 4. Morning came with the soft sounds of the village stirring to life. Annie woke to unfamiliar scents and the gentle murmur of voices speaking a language she didn't understand. For a moment, confusion clouded her mind before the memories of yesterday rushed back. Kimi, the river crossing, the Shawnee village. She sat up quickly, the fur covering falling away from her shoulders. Kimi was already awake, sitting near the dwelling's entrance with her injured ankle stretched before her. The swelling had gone down considerably overnight thanks to the grandmother's poultice. When she saw Annie was awake, Kimi smiled and motioned for her to come over. Outside the dwelling, the village hummed with morning activities. Women tended cooking fires while men gathered in small groups, discussing the day's hunting or work. Children darted between the dwellings, playing games or carrying out small chores. It looked remarkably like mornings in the settlement, though the tools and clothing were different. Kimi's grandmother emerged from a nearby dwelling carrying wooden bowls filled with a steaming porridge. She handed one to each girl along with a wooden spoon. Annie accepted with a grateful nod, her stomach rumbling at the scent. The porridge was different from the oats Rose made, nuttier and sweeter, with berries mixed in that burst with flavor when Annie bit into them. As they ate, the tall man Annie had met yesterday, Kimi's father and apparently an important leader, approached with several other men. Their faces were serious, eyes darting occasionally toward the direction of the river. A discussion followed, with much pointing and gesturing. Annie couldn't understand the words, but the tone was clear. Concern, disagreement, decision. The English-speaking young man from yesterday crouched beside Annie. Chief says men from your village cross river at dawn. Many men with guns. His expression was grim. They look for you.